Hello, 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 everybody. Thank you for coming.
Ourselves or not.
Hello. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. People are still coming in, so we're gonna hang out for just a couple more minutes. And once we kind of see everybody's coming in, we will start. So if you can hang on just a little bit. And today, chat is open to everybody. So if you would like to say hello to everyone, you're more than welcome to. It's so good to see you all. I'm sure you rather meet outside tonight, you know, but we got to stay in today. Yes. All right. People are rather on time today. Very good. David-san! David-san! How are you? What time is it?
9 a.m.
Oh my gosh. How is Tokyo?
Pretty, I guess it's okay. I'm in quarantine right now, home quarantine.
Oh my goodness.
We just came back from the US.
Oh, got it. Got it. Oh, wow. It's so great to have you.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Hello, everyone.
Yeah, wave everybody. There's David.
Hi, David.
Hello. Good to see you.
Good to see you, David.
Been a long time.
Nice to meet you.
Oh, so you'll turn the camera on for David Smith, but not for me. Fine, that, you know, be that way. All right. Yep. Slowly, we're just gonna start, maybe. Just maybe wait one more minute and we will be ready to go. So our staff member is checking you in. If you don't have the name shown as the same name as the name that you registered, one of us may contact you and ask you what's the name that you registered. So if that happens, if you can please kindly answer to that, that will be great. Okay, let's start. If you are okay with it turning the camera on, that would be really nice so that we can kind of see each other. But if you don't, that's all right. Hi, my name is Rio from Japan America Society of Minnesota. It's good to see you, everybody. Oh, I forgot. When I saw Ralph-san's name, Beha-san, I was gonna wear my bow tie and I completely forgot. Oh, but you're not wearing bow tie today either. So next time. Yep. Thank you very much for coming. It's great to see you all. It's pretty cold today, so I think this is a perfect. We're very, very excited to have Professor Schultz here today. Before that, I just want to mention a couple of things. We are going to have J-Quiz on Valentine's Day weekend. And that is a language and culture competition for high school students. And we're gonna do this online this year. And students are very excited and nervous at the same time. So we will report back to you how it worked. So please check out our Tsushing in March so that you can see how students did. And the winners of that competition, they will be participating in the Japan Ball in Washington, D.C., in which, again, unfortunately, it's going to be online this year as well. But they will be competing with the other students from all over the United States. So that's very exciting as well. In February also, we are going to have an artist talk online with Mayumi Amada-san. She is a resident of Minnesota, and then she's from Gunma, and then we are actually from exactly same town. We went to the same elementary school, actually. So I'm very, very excited. And she's an installation artist. She does beautiful artwork. And we get to hear her thoughts behind the artwork. So we are very excited about that. And you will receive the information about that event tomorrow from us. So keep your eye on your emails from us. And again, thank you very much for being here. We cannot do this without you. And then we are so happy that we are still here. Small organization like us, it's amazing that we are still here during this time, and it's all because of your support. Thank you so much. If you are not a member yet, please become a member so that we can keep serving you. And then to those who donated, thank you so much. I think that's it from me. So we're very, again, excited to have Professor Schultz. He is a professor of political science at Hamline University and the professor of law at University of Minnesota, a 3-time Fulbright scholar, and has taught in Europe and Asia. And also he is the author of more than 40 books and 200 articles. And also he shows up in quite a bit of news as a commentator as well. Please help me welcome Professor Schultz.
Thank you very much, all of you. And let me share my screen. I have a PowerPoint for us today, and we should be up and running. And just give me one more second here. I think I'm all set. Yep, all set here. All right, so, but title for tonight is A Tale of Two Friends, A Brief History of Minnesota-Japan Relations. And what I decided to do tonight for this PowerPoint is for people who are, let's say, new members or who are curious and are wondering, well, what's the connection between Japan and Minnesota? And for those of you who maybe have been members for a while, are wondering, well, maybe there's some stuff that I've forgotten or something I don't remember. This is kind of an overview today in terms of sort of the history of the relationship between Minnesota and Japan. I also want to describe this PowerPoint as a work in progress. And what I mean by a work in progress, I learned an incredible amount about the two countries, or about two, I was going to say Minnesota as a country, about Japan and Minnesota in putting this together. But there are also lots of things that I didn't know. And so what I'm hoping at some point is that I'm going to make this PowerPoint available to the society. And maybe you folks can sort of add stories or add things to it, and we can really fill it out and make it a really kind of nice PowerPoint or something like that. And for those of you who have better artistic skills in terms of selecting, like say graphics, or we've got pictures, same thing. So anyhow, consider this a work in progress. Consider this a something that hopefully can become an asset for the organization. So let me get started here. I want to say this is a beginning of a story of a long friendship between Minnesota and Japan. And I should also mention one other thing. I probably today have way more PowerPoint slides than I can really cover with all the information. So I'll probably cover some of the slides pretty briefly, but there's just so much information with each of them. But anyhow, this is the beginning of a story of a long friendship between Minnesota and Japan that takes us back to the 19th century. And that's going to be our starting point here. But some major points just to sort of think about as we go. Minnesota and Japan have a long history of friendship and cooperation. As I mentioned to you, the history goes back to the 19th century. In part, in much of the same way that the railroads helped to build a lot of the Midwest. The relationship between Japan and Minnesota is in part built by the railroads that that basically were built across the northern part of the United States. Um, Another point that I'm going to try to talk about today is that while unfortunately, the story of World War II was not a good story between, let's say, the United States and Japan, what becomes interesting is how Minnesota and Japan's connection actually strengthens as a result of World War II. And in many cases, the experience of Japanese Americans in Minnesota leading up to the war and during the war, um, in many ways was much different than it was for the rest of the United States. Up until 1970, Japanese were the largest ethnic Asian group in Minnesota, which is again interesting because many of us now think about, let us say, the Hmong or other other Asian groups, but until 1970, Japan was clearly the largest. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the business and cultural ties between Minnesota and Japan. And then, of course, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about Walter Mondale and the U.S. ambassador to Japan. So we have lots of parts of the story. Probably each one of those points could be what? A story in it itself. It could be an entire presentation. So the other way I describe it, since I'm a teacher, some of you folks may know what Cliff Notes are. Consider this a Cliff Notes version of a larger story that's out there. So the origins of the Japanese, Minnesota friendship. The original Japanese immigration to the U.S. starts in 1860, expands when in 1884 Japan legalized immigration of workers. The original migration patterns, of course, were to Hawaii and then eventually to the west coast of the United States. You will pardon me when some of my Japanese is not very good. I've only studied very little, so indulge me. The first Japanese in Minnesota pre-World War II were known as the Isai, and they immigrated from the Hiroshima and Kumamoto, Nagasaki regions. And if you look at the map down, on the left-hand side here, we can see so we're in the lower left hand of the picture there, or the map, sort of the regions that we're talking about. Changing Japan-U.S. immigration policies. Again, in 1884, Japan legalizes the immigration, or maybe I should say the emigration of laborers. In 1907, unfortunately, anti-Japanese sentiment leads to U.S. and Japan agreement for the latter to stop issuing passports to laborers, but they continued for family members. 1922, U.S. denies Japanese the right to naturalization. 1924, U.S. Immigration Act denies Japanese from entering the U.S. for the next 28 years under what was the notorious quota system. I just throw this slide in here so that we have kind of a more macro picture of understanding something about sort of U.S. policy. What becomes critical to sort of understanding the Japanese Minnesota connection is the Great Northern Railroad Company. And the Great Northern Railroad Company was looking to build a railroad that would go from Chicago to Milwaukee, across through the Twin Cities, straight out west, connect out to Seattle. And to do that, they needed to recruit literally thousands and thousands of workers. So the Great Northern Railroad Company recruits thousands of Japanese initially to move to Seattle to begin working on the railroad, but several of them eventually moved to Minnesota, both to work on, let's say, Minnesota segments of the rail line, as well as eventually to take other jobs. But despite the souring relationships between the U.S. and Japan, Minnesota became, became a source for single Japanese men to come for work. To come for work. I'm finding all my typos now. To come for work and eventually for their families. Most of the Japanese in the Twin Cities were working for the railroads or the then Nicollet Hotel. Not a surprise. Some who came here to work left Minnesota due to the cold weather. And I guess for all of us who've been experiencing the last few days in Minnesota, I think we can all appreciate that feeling. This becomes interesting. Looking at census data in terms of, we can get it back, for quite a few years. The U.S. Census data, specifically looking at in Minnesota. So what we're looking at here are the number of Japanese or Japanese descendants, but for a lot of these, it was actually Japanese who were in Minnesota. And the 1880 census records the first person. What I would so love to do is to be able to track down the name of that very first person and to maybe profile them. If anybody has any ideas and who this or information on it, it would be great. But just sort of look at the pattern here from 1881 to 1900, it's sort of, I guess we're going to call it, explodes to 51, 67, 85, kind of goes down 69, 51, but that kind of gives us a pattern. Like I mentioned to you, excuse me, I'm sorry, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the growth of the population of the state in part, but also, of course, for sort of Japanese emigration to Minnesota, was driven by the railroads, again, as I mentioned, by the Great Northern Railway Company. Early Minnesota Japanese business connections, I'd say early 20th century St. Paul company delivered flour to Yokohama, and up until and through the 1960s, took Minnesota iron ore to Japan for their steel mills. There's a great, in the map that I'm highlighting here is Minnesota. The red is sort of part of the Iron Range. And there would be just a really interesting story to talk about in terms of the interrelationship between the Iron Range, which really was producing taconite and iron up until roughly the early 1960s, and the story of how it connects, really to Japan. So mining in the state very strongly connecting again to Japan. We unfortunately, as part of our story unfolds here, we have World War II, the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 41. U.S. goes to war with Japan, and unfortunately, the story is of a significant explosion of anti-Japanese sentiment across the United States. One of what we would say is one of the sorrier stories in American history is the Japanese internment camps. The military ordered more than 110,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast to relocate to the internment camps. Equally as sorry is how the Supreme Court upheld that action in a famous case, Korematsu versus the United States. And I give the citation there for those of you who don't know about it. It was a case where the Supreme Court basically says that, the military has decided that Japanese Americans are dangerous. They didn't really offer any evidence. And the Supreme Court basically said at this point, well, we're just going to defer to the military and let them make this choice. But despite the war, the Japanese population in Minnesota grows from 51 in 1940 to over 1,000 in 1950. I mean, that's a pretty dramatic growth. And there are 4 sort of reasons for the significant growth that occurred. I'll mention them here, then go into a little bit more detail. First, some of the Japanese Americans relocated from the West Coast to avoid the internment. And so they decided to brave the cold and move out here so they wouldn't have to go to the relocation camps. Second, several educational institutions facilitated relocation to the state. Third, we had several civic groups help promote and encourage relocation. And then one of the stories that I didn't know much about, which is going to be fascinating, is the creation of the Military Intelligence Service Language School. So all these become really quite interesting drivers. So now, in terms of Minnesota schools reach out to Japanese Americans. During the 1940s, several colleges and universities recruited more than 300 Nisei students from the West Coast colleges, assisted by the Japanese American Student Relocation Council. Because of course, when the Japanese on the West Coast were ordered, Japanese Americans were ordered into internment camps, that basically meant what? The college students were forced out of their forced out of college, and either had to go to the camps, or again relocate elsewhere, maybe find some other schools. And schools including McAllister, Hamlin, that's a picture of Hamlin. Since I teach there, I get the prerogative of putting that picture up. Schools included McAllister, Hamlin, St. Catherine, St. Thomas, St. Cloud State, and Carleton, and the latter of which enrolled students as early as 42 to 43, were schools that helped admit and facilitated the relocation of Japanese American students into Minnesota colleges. In 1943, or leading up to 1943, in 1942, there was a lot of debate at the University of Minnesota regarding whether or not they should also reach out and to try to enroll Japanese American students. Finally, after a lot of wrangling, what wound up happening is that the regent said, "Okay, we will approve. We will approve admission, but only if they pass a security clearance." Despite that, despite some of this wrangling, despite some of this, at least from my opinion, unfounded fear, by 1946, only the Chicago area had matriculated more Nisei students, and so we had a fairly large, I guess, contingency cohort, nucleus. I'm not sure what I'm looking for here in terms of students. Civics groups also reached out. Okay. Now, again, stories that are not very good initially is a story of St. Paul. Initially, the St. Paul police chief at the time, and I don't have his name, I should probably add that to the picture here, add it to the story here, wanted to ban Japanese from relocating to Minnesota and to St. Paul from the West Coast. Many groups encouraged that relocation nonetheless. The fall of 1942, the St. Paul Resettlement Committee, supported by the International Institute of Minnesota, reached out to try to facilitate recruitment and relocation. There was work with the War Relocation Authority and the National Committee for the Resettlement of Japanese Americans, again trying to reach out. There were more than 80 Minnesota groups, a whole host of them, which I have got listed here, which really, again, reached out is the word, which really facilitated relocation. And in some sense, this becomes kind of the model that we eventually saw in Minnesota for what? After the Vietnam War, reaching out to Vietnamese, to the Thai population, and then more recently, to the Somalis and Ethiopian populations. This becomes the model. And then I have a picture here of which, again, it could be a story in of itself, of Ruth Tambara, among the first Japanese Americans, it should say, relocated to Minnesota. She eventually becomes a leader in the community to help many others settle in the state. And so, again, her story would be just a fascinating one to develop, and I'd love to do more so. Now, what becomes one of the other drivers of relocation is something called the Military Intelligence Service Language School. Before World War II, the U.S. military determined that there was a need for competent Japanese translation skills. Few Caucasians knew Japanese, and some of the Nisei were recruited. The original school, the Military Intelligence Service Language School, opened up the Presidio in San Francisco in November of 1941, forced to relocate after Pearl Harbor and the internment order. So you're asking, where does the Military Intelligence Language School at the Presidio fit into the story? Again, the original class The original location of this school was in San Francisco at the Presidio. It opened with 60 students. Again, as I pointed out, it was what the American military was surprised by was how few of the Japanese Americans actually were fluent back in Japanese. In 1941, a survey of 3,700 in U.S. uniform revealed only 3% fluent. So again, just an interesting statistic here, and especially juxtaposing the fact where the U.S. seemed to think that Japanese Americans were what, so dangerous, such a threat to America. I just think some of these statistics become interesting. So the language school is initially in the Presidio, but the Military Intelligence Service Language School moves to Minnesota. The original location of it was in Savage, Minnesota, kind of in the Lakeville Shakopee area, in a building that formerly housing elderly indigent men. There's actually, I can't remember if I have it in the PowerPoint, there's actually a historical marker in Minnesota that shows the location of the original school. This language school moves to Minnesota in the Savage area, moves to Fort Snelling in 1944, and then eventually moves back to the West Coast after 1946. The picture, which is not the best one here, on the right-hand side shows an old kind of grainy photograph from the 1940s of the original location, again in Savage, Minnesota. So kind of interesting to look at there. Military language school, then language service school, eventually moves to Fort Snelling. The school moves to Fort Snelling in 1944, and by 1946, when it left Minnesota, it had graduated nearly 6,000 individuals, overwhelmingly Japanese American males. And so I will be curious to see, I think it's later this year, that the Minnesota Historical Society has been in the process of spending, 3 years and however many dollars in terms of restoring Fort Snelling, and supposedly going to talk about all the many different histories associated with Fort Snelling. I'm going to be curious to see what story is told about the language school. Among the early graduates or attendees of that language school was Toshio Abe, originally born in California, relocates from San Diego to Camp Savage, among the first 200 to attend the school in Minnesota, finishes his work here, serves with distinction in the U.S. military in New Delhi and then Burma. After the war, decides to return to Minnesota to live. And I would just point out, for those of you who sort of pay attention to genealogy and so forth, many people describe him as sort of one of the great examples of what we call the World War II, or the greatest generation. And just a wonderful quote for him here, I'll let you look at here, about finding the experience of moving to Minnesota welcoming. One of the things all of you may be wondering, and so am I, is the story that I'm mostly telling is a story of how Minnesota bucked the trend nationwide. That the hysteria, the prejudice, the paranoia against Japanese Americans takes across, it basically catches fire across the United States and on the West Coast. In Minnesota, I'm not going to say was perfect, not going to say there wasn't discrimination, but in many ways it did buck that trend. And one of the interesting questions is why? Why was Minnesota more open, more welcoming compared to let's say the rest of the United States? And that's part of the story that I'm still interested in researching and interested in telling. Additionally, in 1944, the St. Paul Council on Human Relations shows a film at the State Fair documenting the plight of Japanese Americans, and it portrays the plight in very, very sympathetic fashions, and again encouraging Minnesotans to open, to be welcoming, and so forth. So again, it would be wonderful at some point, if we could find that film, that would probably be really, from a historical point of view, quite interesting to watch. Uh, as I mentioned before, we could, the population in Minnesota, Japanese Americans was growing. 1940, but it was 1940, it was 41 individuals. 1950, over 1,000. 1950, Minneapolis alone had 670 Japanese Americans. 1950, St. Paul had 184 Japanese Americans. A scattering across the rest of the state of Minnesota. Another part of the fascinating story about sort of the connection between Minnesota and Japan is what was originally called Northwest Orient Airlines. Northwest Orient Airlines eventually changes its name to Northwest Airlines, based out of the Twin Cities, and then Northwest Airlines eventually acquired by Delta Airlines. But in the spring of 1947, Northwest Orient Airlines began stationing employees at the Haneda Airport in Tokyo, flying them from the United States via Alaska on what's called the Great Circle route. And why this is important is that after the war, Douglas MacArthur, who was basically General MacArthur, was sort of overseeing Japan after, I guess war reconstruction. And airlines were restricted in terms of flying in and out of and in Japan. And so what happened is that Northwest became the first airline to begin direct service between the United States and Japan, again, using what the Douglas DC-4 airliner named the Manila. I was trying to find a good picture of the Manila, didn't find it. But so this flight from Japan to Minnesota becomes one of the first in the country, connecting the countries. And then Japanese Airlines, Northwest Airlines. Post-World War II, aviation of any kind was banned in Japan by order of U.S. General Douglas MacArthur. In 1950, MacArthur allows for the creation of a new domestic airline. And in 1951, Northwest Airlines helps with the formation of JAL. So we've got this relationship in Minnesota with the two major with two major airlines. Again, an interesting part of the story. Another part of the story is the International Chick Sexing Association, and this is not what you folks think it is. Okay, it was an association which tried to help identify the gender of baby chicks. It was and it's very difficult to do for those of you who ever grew up on a farm. But the technique of being able to do that was perfected in Japan, and eventually it moves this. Eventually, the company or the association moves to California and then to Mankato. And so it's just kind of an interesting story also about businesses and relocating. Of course, despite the friendship, some ugly times, we know that discrimination did exist in Minnesota. I found some things like in terms of like news items, some, let's say, op-eds and so forth like that. Again, I chose not to, sort of include this in this presentation, but we knew it was out there. Japanese were not allowed to join many of the private clubs that existed across the Twin Cities and in Minnesota. That International Chick Sexing Association was eventually forced to leave Minnesota because of discrimination. And there's a larger story about racial covenants and racial discrimination in housing in Minnesota, including Minneapolis and St. Paul. And of course, unfortunately, the Japanese Americans were also discriminated against in terms of that. Post-World War II, we see a steady population growth, steady growth from 1950 to 1970, from slightly over 1,000 to 2,603. Many Japanese Americans chose to stay or relocate in Minnesota after they had, even though they had the option of relocating back to the West Coast after the war, or after the Language Institute was moved back to the West Coast. Many chose to either stay or relocate. And for the most part, Minneapolis, St. Louis Park, and St. Paul were sort of the major places where most of the population was. What forms in 1946, we start to have the Japanese American Citizens League in Minnesota, formed in 1946, from formation 46 of the Twin Cities chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League. Reverend Daisuke Kitagawa helps form some religious organizations and groups that would be instrumental as part of several groups and this association in terms of trying to foster better relationships. There were several Minnesota churches, the Twin Cities Buddhist Association, Twin Cities Independent Church, and the Rainbow Club, which was supposed to be almost like a club or support group for young, newly married Japanese couples. Okay. Some other fascinating stories here in the 1950s and 60s. And Nisei helped sustain the Japanese American population. Social organizations such as the Japanese American Center became focal points, eventually closing in 65. There was a bowling league, and then there was the Japanese American Journal, published through the 1950s and early 1960s. Again, for all of these, there would just be wonderful things to get, like pictures, stories of maybe people who might have been in the bowling leagues and so forth like that. Just really interesting. Additionally, there is a story, and I'm not sure how I depict this story, all about war brides. There was significant male to female ratio in terms of males who were Japanese, of Japanese ancestry, who were looking for brides. They were encouraged and supported migration of Japanese women who married American men in the military. There was a War Brides Club that met in the Japanese Center through the late 1950s. Again, there's a lot more of a story to be told here, and a lot more research needs to be done about this aspect of the story. And then St. Paul and Nagasaki become the first sister cities between Japan and any city in the United States. The St. Paul Nagasaki Sister City Committee was commissioned as the first Japanese American city partnership in 1955, well predating the International Sister City affiliation enacted by Congress during the Eisenhower administration. And St. Paul Mayor Dillon officially invites the mayor of the city of Nagasaki to recognize the sister city relation. Again, there's just some wonderful stories here to develop. Now, the spelling is correct here. It's the Minnehaha Arts Center in Minneapolis from 74 to 79, provided public education on Japanese culture. And some of these members moved to the Minnesota Asian American Project at some point when it closed. You'll notice on the right side, it's a blank. I tried in vain to find a picture of that center. Could not find one. So again, things in terms of viewing this PowerPoint as a work in progress, can we add to it? Other parts of our story here is eventually what the Charlotte Partridge Ordway Japanese Garden, Como Park in St. Paul. The garden design was a gift from the people of Nagasaki, a sister city. Again, it just sort of becomes a turnaround from those earlier stories in St. Paul, where, again, I mentioned to you as St. Paul, what police chief seemed to be particularly discriminatory, I'll just simply say that, are prejudiced against Japanese Americans. This is an interesting story. There was a Nagasaki Road in St. Paul. Now, the original Nagasaki Road was dedicated near Harriet Island in 1961. It disappeared with modern renovation and reconstruction, but in 2015, St. Paul renames a road near Como Park, Nagasaki Road. This is right near the, right near the gardens. And so, again, interesting sort of, story here. Business and trade, post-World War II, but especially, let's say, 60s and 70s, starts to take off. So Japanese companies invest in Minnesota and across several economic sectors. A lot of times it started off as research and development collaboration with the University of Minnesota. And these were just some of the early companies here, Olympus Surgical Technologies and so forth, that emerge. Now, how significant is the economic relationship? This is a really interesting question here. Okay. In 2019, Minnesota companies exported hundreds of millions of dollars in goods and services to Japan. I was trying to pin this down a little bit better based upon the research that I did and some international trade information. Couldn't really nail it down to a dollar amount that I would like. Japan is the fourth largest foreign employer in Minnesota, approximately 35 companies in 2019. But then there's this next statistic, which I am not sure what to think about. DEED, which is one of the state agencies in Minnesota, there's an estimate from them of 161 Japanese-owned companies in Minnesota. I can't verify that number. I can't figure out how they came up with that number. And so I threw this in here with a question mark. And then again, Japan is Minnesota's fourth largest trading partner, as well as fourth largest employer. And so some of these numbers about employment and dollar amounts of trade, I put some quotation marks or question marks around because I'm not comfortable with the information in terms of verifying it. And then Governor Walz visits Japan September 17th and 18th. Governor Tim Walz did a trade trip to Japan to strengthen economic and business ties. And now, just to give you some information that we have now, the current Japanese ancestry in Minnesota, as of the 2019 census, and we don't have the 2020 census in good detail yet. There are 11,442 individuals of Japanese ancestry in Minnesota. 76% are in the Twin Cities, 23% in Greater Minnesota. And Japanese are the fourth largest Asian population in Minnesota, behind India, China, and the Philippines. And again, I just, for a picture here, decided to depict, because I've only been there once, the Normandale Japanese Gardens. In 1972, this association, the Japanese American Society of Minnesota, was founded in 72 as a member of the National Association of Japan American Societies. And then we can't forget the fact that Walter Mondale becomes the U.S. ambassador to Japan, serving as ambassador from 1993 to 1996. Again, another aspect or feature of the connection between Japan and Minnesota. And as I bring a close here, because I think I was allotted around 40 or 45 minutes for my presentation here, what I want to emphasize again, this is only the beginning of a story of Japan in Minnesota. What can you add to it? There must be those of you who are listening today or know others or have other sources of which we can add to this PowerPoint. I obviously need to clean it up, add to some stuff to it, but I would love this to become kind of a, if you're so interested, of the basis of a PowerPoint that the society owns, of which we then can use for I don't know, information or whatever it may be. So consider this my work in progress, my draft, my contribution to try to give us a little bit of a history about a fascinating relationship. And so I think that's the end of where I want to be. And let's see, let me stop share. And I'm back.
David-san,
I hope
thank
you
you
folks
so
enjoy-
much. It was wonderful. It's wonderful. Personally, it just always hits me about the story about the Japanese Americans who came here, and because of they led the path for people like me, and then because of them, I can be here, and then I'm married to a Minnesotan, and then have a happy life here, and I owe my life in Minnesota to them, and I always want to thank them for their well-behaved life in Minnesota, and I really appreciate them very much. So thank you for talking about them. Questions in chat. It says the fourth largest after India, Philippines, and such. Can you clarify this stat? I would think Hmong and Vietnamese would be bigger, question mark.
Yeah, and see, this is, yeah, Megan, this is interesting too, because that was my first impulse too. I was thinking I was going to find the Hmong and the Vietnamese a much larger percentage of the population, but I was sifting through, and this is why some of the stuff we need to go back and double check on. When I was sifting through some of the information from like from the state of Minnesota, kind of like their official information, where they talk about different populations and demographics and so forth. This is the information I got from that site. I question that myself. Because I would think that the Hmong and Vietnamese would be much larger also. But this is something that I got it from a state agency. I do think it's wrong myself. But nonetheless, I could still say that comfortably through 1970, there was no question that Japanese Americans ancestry was the largest Asian population ancestry. Again, I agree with you. I think we have to maybe relook at some of this stuff, and maybe after the 2020 census comes out, where I can actually analyze it, we can get a better read on that. No, so I don't disagree with you.
Bob-san.
Yeah, I was just wondering if that may, at least some of the organizations may be looking at foreign passport holders versus US citizens, and that might cause some of the difference.
And that's possible. That's one of the questions that I had also too, because one of the things when I looked at all this census data over time, what they don't separate out for me is sort of ancestry versus, let us say, citizenship issue.
Mhm.
And so when I was talking about saying, for example, like there were 1,000 Japanese Americans, in Minnesota, right by 1950, I don't have a good picture in terms of, are we talking about US citizens? Are we talking about people who hadn't become citizens yet? So your question is really, really good here. And I would love to be able to parse that out a little bit and get a better picture of that, because that might tell us something about, exactly right, some of these, what looks like discrepancies.
Thank you. Mari-san. Oh, お久しぶりです. Please.
Yeah. Okay. I read the book by the St. Paul author, William Kent Kruger, called Ordinary Grace, a couple of years ago. And he has a Japanese character there from the 1920s and 30s. I was looking all over the place for the information that you provided today. So I'm really glad that you provided that information, that there were actually Japanese Americans here before World War II.
Right.
Some other things I thought, since you wanted to know what we could add, what was going through my head when you were showing the chick sexing thing is, every time I was in Japan and I met people like 10 years older than I am, they would always say that there's this famous song from the 1950s called Minnesota no Tamago Uri. So we're selling Minnesota eggs. So and they'd get all excited and start singing that Minnesota egg song. So I'd always wondered, like, what is the backstory of that Minnesota egg song? And when you gave that story about the chicks, I thought maybe it has something to do with that. I don't know.
Yeah.
And another thing, I've been looking all over, especially since Mondale passed away, is I know that there was an essay when he first became ambassador saying that he thought that the Minnesota personality was similar to the Japanese personality in that they are very shy and don't like hugging.
Uh-huh.
And I looked all over for that essay and I can't find it. So if you ever find it,
Okay.
I'm really interested in seeing that again.
Let's write this note down there.
Yeah.
A couple of things I want to add here is one of the things which I could add to this PowerPoint, I could think on my own right away, is maybe at the end, put the bibliography there of the sources that I looked at. That way we'd have something like that. Second, you're just sort of mentioning about that about that song. You know, as I said, you know, almost every slide that I think I have here today could be like a story in and of itself, you know, like a long one. And so it would be great if we could get that song, like, you know, again, I'm not that proficient with PowerPoint, but if you did one, if we could like embed part of that song into the PowerPoint and play that when I get to that, because I'd never thought about that either. I know the song you're referring to, it'd just be really fun to have that in there. Yeah, good. There is someone had something up here also about the St. Paul, what, if I go back here, was the St. Paul police chief also concerned about German Americans in St. Paul during World War II? The answer is no. The Germans didn't seem to bother the police chief quite as much as the Japanese did. And so that probably speaks a lot for itself right there. And someone has here what? The Japanese American Community Center was in 2200 Blasdale. There should be a plaque there. Ooh, that would be interesting to see that. Okay, so I got to write this down. Or if anybody, again, for all of you here, you know, every one of you who's attending here today, if you want to afterwards, like send me information, you know, actually, I'm going to put my email in here. If you've got anything that you can send to me, you know, that I can work with, you know, members of the society, again, if they're so interested, and we can put together what I think eventually could be a really pretty cool PowerPoint and presentation that would be available. So all of you have probably got stories here that I've never even heard. Well, someone asked me, what was the impetus for why to put together the Japanese Minnesota History of Friendship? Well, it's interesting. It was about, I want to say 10 or 15 years ago. It's actually kind of interesting. I was sitting in my office at Hamlin, and I get a call from a person who was like the secretary to the consular general's office in Chicago. And the person said, the consular general is coming to Minnesota. You know, Minnesota is one of his sort of, was it like 11 or 12 states, whatever is within his territory out of Chicago. And he said he would like to have lunch with you to talk about I can't remember what election it was at that point, but about American politics or the presidential election, or maybe it was a Minnesota election. And I said, sure, I'd be happy to meet with you, and developed a relationship with the consular general. And over the years, as they've changed out, I've stayed friends with the various consular generals who have come and gone, and just have developed a I guess I'm going to say a friendship, a working relationship with them. And so I thought this would be, and I've been a member of the society for a few years. I just thought this would be a nice thing to do, and I thought I would learn a ton, and I did. I learned an incredible amount. So that's probably a little bit of the story that we're talking about here. And you're right, there are other governors who have visited Japan: Dayton, Ventura, Palenti, again, speaking to sort of what the durability and the strength of the relationship, and I think the recognition of both Japan and Minnesota of the strength of the relationship. I know Bob has one here for me too. He says, David, the Consul General of Chicago may have accurate information about Japan companies and employment in Minnesota. That's actually a good idea. But I also know from having talked to them, they've a couple of times have asked me and say, do you know any other companies? And so it's like, well, okay, we exchange our cards to try to figure out here. So I think that's actually a good question here. You know, and if I actually were to expand it more, if we look at Minnesota and the Dakotas, North and South Dakota, there's actually quite a few both, let's say, Japanese-owned businesses, and also I'm going to say companies in which Japan has significant interests in, or businesses. Okay, so this is Mac. I think it'd be interesting to add many more about the other sister relationship we have in Minnesota. Yeah, I did mention the St. Paul one, Bloomington, Minneapolis. It's a good story. I should probably try to figure this out also in terms of how many cities have sister city relationships.
We have 7 right now.
7 is, do you know what the 7 are?
So we have Winona, Duluth, Cambridge, and St. Paul, Bloomington, Minneapolis. What am I missing?
Red Wing.
Red Wing. Yes, 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 yes.
All right.
St.
Good. I'll add
Cloud.
it. Okay, so someone's asking me about wanting to read more about the Northwest Orient Airlines JAL connection and so forth. Believe it or not, actually, if you go to Delta Airlines, and if you put in like Delta Airlines Japan history, they have a really great website that describes this. And obviously can't get there because of the pandemic right now, but most of us who go to the airport, we're never thinking about looking at some of the historical stuff that they have there. But there's actually some, I'm not sure I call it a museum, but there's information at the airport also in the Twin Cities about sort of the history of relationship. But look up JAL, Northwest Orient Airlines webs for your Google search, and you'll get some really interesting stuff that is there. Ooh, okay. Minnesota Timberwolves played in Tokyo. That I forgot about. We'll have to add that to the story at some point here about the basketball game. All right, cool. Yeah.
I was going to say too, with the Northwest relationship, due to when they got their foothold in Japan, they also, and I'm not sure if Delta still has it, but they had some incredibly lucrative property in the Hyo area. Beautiful guest house that we would actually have Japan America Society of Minnesota Japan branch meetings in back in the day, and apartment building for their foreign expatriate employees. So incredible, and they also got a hub in Narita, which is incredibly unique, that they could then fly to Narita and then go on to other Asian destinations, and that I think is what made them so made Delta want to acquire them, was having that
Oh yeah, yeah.
incredible,
You're right.
very rare foothold in Japan that was due to their long-term relationship from post-war days.
Yeah, yeah. I read it one time, and I can't remember when it was. Back when it was still Northwest Airlines, before it got gobbled up by Delta. At one point, I had read something, and I couldn't find that statistic, that it was something like 40 or 50% of the value of Northwest Airlines was real estate in Japan, and I suspect that was accurate too. I mean, because the holdings were absolutely enormous. Huge naval connection, of course. Sure. Yeah. See that? Look at all the stuff we can add to the story here. This is great. Who else has sort of thoughts or whatever like that? I mean, a couple of points I want to come back to. Again, I think I mentioned to you in the beginning, I would love to find out the name of the first person who appears on the census. I think that would be such a cool story to add to it. And then still, why? To understand the question of why did Minnesota buck the trend of the rest of the country and develop this relationship? That again, I think it just becomes a really nice, really kind of a nice thing to try to figure out here. Anybody else?
Hi, David. This is Ron. How are you?
Good, Ron. How you doing? Glad to see you
Pretty
tonight.
good. I thought that Fort Snelling piece was really interesting too. And my wife and I, having lived here for 20 years, we never went. And we went a year and a half ago, right before COVID, for the first time. And they actually do have a segment in their pamphlet around the Japanese language school already in the information, which was really interesting. I had no idea.
Yeah.
So they actually do profile it already, and you can dig in further maybe, but wondering if all that really helped with the relationship too, because you had all these Japanese, like you said, mostly men, but helping, in the military intelligence.
Yeah, that's what I'm kind of wondering, is if the fact that, and again, this is speculation on both of our parts here, if the fact that we had Japanese American men working and supporting the U.S. military effort, if it kind of softened the relationship. If you know what I'm getting here, that's a really good hypothesis, a really good idea, good argument.
David, I had a question about the Nagasaki sister city relationship. or maybe somebody else on this call knows the answer to this, but I'm wondering if that was a controversial decision. You know, it was only 10 years after the war. Many people had been touched by the war personally. And I know in our case in Minneapolis, there's been suggestions of other cities around the world that have been very much opposed. So I'm wondering if you have any knowledge of that. And also, I had always heard that that was a personal request from President Eisenhower to Louis Hill of the Hill family to establish that relationship. Does anybody know if that's in fact true?
Yeah, I can't offer on either of those. Those are great questions. I've heard the Hill story, but I don't know if it's true. But I would have to think that there would have been a lot of controversy or probably some pushback in some quarters at, you know, what was it, like early 1950s? I would think so. Yeah.
Shira-san mentions that, wasn't it a priest who started the sister city relationship? I heard the way back from one of the sisters at St. Kate's.
It could be. That, again, part of a story that we can add to this in terms of do we, you know, again, it's probably possible to hunt some of this information down, I guess. Okay. Wyoming. Duluth.
Miria is suggesting in the chat visiting the St. Paul Nagasaki Sister Cities website. I would second that recommendation.
Great.
As the new president of the Sister Cities. I ought to have the answers to those, but I don't.
Okay.
Yeah, I know as far as it being controversial, I know that there were several founding members, including Ruth Tanbara, who you mentioned in your PowerPoint. So I guess my question would be controversial to whom, but then I couldn't answer you either. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but it might be worth at some point for you and I to talk a little bit, maybe exchange some whatever information we have, if we could maybe figure out something on this. But I think your answer is correct. When we say it's controversial, it's always to whom. Yeah. Camden.
Is there any, maybe one last question, if you want to raise hand, if I can see, or just start talking so that Ben-san.
Yes, it was. I also want to say that the early history of the development of the friendship between Minnesota and Japan was very interesting, Professor Schultz. Thank you very much for that. One of the companies that has done a Japanese company that has done a lot for the state is Daikin, and it's located in Plymouth. And I think I didn't know if it was indicated on your list of Japanese companies, Professor Schultz, but I think that would be a good inclusion. Daikin.
Good. Excellent. Good.
Daikin
Good.
is a household word in Japan, and they established a very strong headquarters for R&D in
Good.
Minnesota, and it's a wonderful development.
Yeah. The more information that we're getting, what I'm hearing today, we're all sharing today, we're realizing how much thicker the relationship is between Japan and Minnesota, which is really quite nice to find out.
All
Good,
right.
thanks for telling me.
Thank you, everybody. Before I forget and Yoko-san gets mad at me, I would like to do a group photo today. So if you don't mind turning your camera on so that we can do photograph, that will be great.
Adio-san.
Yes.
I think Itsuko-san raised her hand.
Oh, sorry about that. Let's have the last question of the day.
Yes, it's not the question, and it's Peterson. It's the first time to join. We moved to Alaska for 2 years ago. I know, from Alaska to here for 2 years ago, because my husband is from Minneapolis. So just I want to say, hello to everyone. And I'm in Narita airport area right now. So I'm participating from Narita City because I just came back 5 days ago. Then I have to wait more, 5 more days in the hotel and get ready to go home my hometown. But that was very nice opportunity being in Japan. then I had a chance to join this event. So I just want to say thank you. Then I didn't know anything about the relation of Minnesota and Japan, but that was a good opportunity for me to hear. I just want to say thank you. This is the first event I joined since I joined this Japanese American, Minnesota club. So
That's great. Thank you so
Nice.
much for joining
you.
us and welcome.
Thank
Welcome,
you.
welcome.
yes, bye. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
All
you.
right. Oh, wow. Thank you. Yoko-san, thank you for noticing. All right.
Thank you.
What should we say today instead of cheese for camera? Should we say friendship? That's how we smile. Okay. Ready, everybody? 1, 2, 3. Friendship. Okay, Yoko-san, いいですか? Okay, great. So I was kind of thinking that maybe like people can email Professor Schultz, but also I'm gonna try to come up with like a bulletin board on our website so that when somebody puts comment on it, we all can see that everybody's information and they can build on it also. So that might be good so that it can be a discussion among us. So I will try to build that and then share with you. And again, thank you very much for coming. And from Japan too, this is wonderful. And stay warm, and I'll see you in another event. Thank you. Have a good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Right.
Thank you so much.
All right. Good night, everybody.